Welcome to the program. My guest is Brian Balogh. Brian is a professor of history at the University of Virginia, and he is co-host of Backstory Radio, the nationally syndicated podcast. It's online at backstoryradio.org. Brian, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Coy.
I'm so glad you're here. I want to talk about the presidency, governance of America. You have spent your career studying how presidents do what they do, the federal government, the very idea of governance in a constitutional democracy. And I want to begin with a very open-ended question, Brian. In the last few weeks and months, watching the election of Donald Trump, and now the first few weeks of his administration, through the context of your work as a historian, I'm just curious, what has crossed your mind?
Probably what's crossed the minds of tens of millions of Americans, unprecedented. It's rare that I say anything is unprecedented. I've studied a lot of history, and in many ways on our podcast Backstory, what we do is we put people at ease. We say, don't worry. This has happened millions of times before we survived it. I want to be clear, we will survive a rocky start by President Trump, but his approach to governance, his attitude towards governance, his attitude towards you, the press, all of this is rather unprecedented.
And are there any lessons from history of how Americans have dealt with the unprecedented in the past? Because though Trump is unprecedented, something that is unprecedented is not. So Americans have had the new and the startling before in their governments.
Of course. So to stick with the 20th century, we have the example of Richard Nixon. One of my colleagues at the Miller Center mentioned that Trump's first 3 weeks are like the entire Nixon administration wrapped into 3 weeks. But certainly the kind of constitutional crisis that Americans faced when Richard Nixon really conspired to cover up the Watergate break-in and all kinds of shenanigans that created a constitutional crisis. Certainly that's a good example of Americans dealing with a president who was hiding behind executive privilege. In order to carry on illegal activities. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump has necessarily done anything illegal, but you asked for an example of how do Americans deal with things unprecedented. It took a while. And for those core Nixon supporters, they supported Nixon to the bitter end. We recall the, quote, heroes like Howard Baker, the moderate Republican. Your viewers probably need a little lesson. There used to be Republicans and Democrats who were called moderate. But Howard Baker, who crossed partisan lines to ask tough questions about Watergate. In spite of that, Nixon retained a very hardcore of supporters who, to the bitter end, never believed that he did anything wrong. They believed that, as Nixon put it, I'm not a crook. Whereas being the crook wasn't the issue. Violating the Constitution was.
Right. And we know from the tapes and the great work done at the Miller Center that Nixon was eager to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. And it was Kissinger in private conversations that said, no, Mr. President, no, it's too much. And he said, well,
that's good.
Well, thank you. And he said, Henry, I want you to think bold. Think bold, Henry. I mean, but that was a tension between the two, that Nixon didn't think Henry was being tough enough. And Nixon had Kissinger at that moment said, you know what? That's a great idea. That's what we need to do. And I know that is a concern of millions of Americans, that in one of those conversations, Trump's going to say, we need to use nuclear weapons. We need to be tough. And he won't have a Kissinger there saying, you know what? No, that's over the line.
Well, here's where I'm going to defend President Trump. I'm not saying that he does not have a proclivity for choosing people who are loyal to him. You might even call them yes people, mainly men, but yes people. But in fairness, if you look at his cabinet, he's chosen a number of people who, at least if you look at their background, don't necessarily agree with him on every issue.
Very fair point.
So I don't think you can pin that one on President Trump right now.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And we certainly saw that at the United Nations when his
It's a great example.
Right. She came out right after he said, I don't care. One
Haley.
state, two state in Israel and Palestine, I don't care what happens over there as long as there's peace. She came out within 24 hours and said, no, we still support a two-state solution.
She also, a few weeks earlier, was pretty tough on Russia at the very time that President Trump has been accused of going too easy on Russia. So these are examples. And then the final example I'll give is, although not all of the leaks that are part of our daily lives are coming from the White House, almost certainly some of those leaks are coming from the White House. That suggests that there are real differences of opinion in the White House. And that suggests, going back to your example, that there probably are people who are willing to stand up to Trump. Now, whether he will listen to them, I don't know.
Yeah. Brian, you mentioned the supporters of Nixon who stayed true to him till the end. Some of them in my family. So I remember that very, very well as a child. How do you make sense as a historian who knows that full pageant of the American story? How do you look at that divide that we see right now between the Trump supporters and those who see the Trump presidency as the precipice of the end and the potential for great tragedy in the American story? How do you make sense of that going on today?
Well, I do think you have to turn to very different cultural understandings of history, of what it means to be American, of religion, of citizenship itself. I do think I don't know if we're more divided than we've ever been as a nation. Certainly we're more divided during the Civil War. I can point to other...
It's been worse.
It has been worse. I do know that our divisions are out there, right? During much of American history, I don't think that African American thought was consistent with the thought of many white Americans. But we didn't hear those voices. I don't think that the thought of many women was consistent with the thought of men.
But they were muted.
We didn't hear those. So what I would say about the situation we're facing today is, yes, we have our divisions, but boy, do we hear about those divisions. And you know, the term echo chamber is, whether it's a chamber or not, people always focus on the chamber part, people just talking to each other. But they forget about the echo, and echo means to repeat. And so our differences are repeated, like an echo. And I think that just makes matters worse in many ways.
And I heard somebody say the other day, Americans have always been divided. Our revolution was a civil war. Americans were fighting Americans over the big question of whether or not we should remain part of the British Empire.
Absolutely. And both sides felt they were loyal Americans, and both sides felt they were being loyal British North Americans. It's just that the king had forgotten what it really meant to be British and what it meant to be a British North American.
Brian, you mentioned the echo chamber, and I'm sitting here thinking about fake news and post-truth, and the work that I do as a journalist, and the challenge we have every day to seek, to find, and then to share truth with the American people. But now you have millions of Americans who look at that truth and say, that's not true. And it's not true because you said it. That's my metric. That's how I know. I mean, that's what Trump said in his press conference. I'm so mad at these leaks. They're leaking these things that are true that I didn't want you to know about it. But the moment CNN tells you, it's fake news.
Well, Coy, you know, I'm a little bit older than you, I suspect, but both of us have come of age during a period in which there has been a pretty much nonstop assault on authority. Certainly from the right, the authority of the national government, conservative Republicans have attacked the legitimacy of the national government and what it can do
Right.
for at least 30 or 40 years. Progressives and liberals have attacked the authority of, let's say, scholars who believed in a certain canon of Western literature that had a hierarchy that was closer to truth.
Yeah.
It was more real, it was more pure. So for the last 40 or 50 years, we have lived in a world that all kinds of authority and legitimacy have come under attack. We've witnessed the rise of novels that feature anti-heroes, not heroes. The John Waynes in the movies are gone.
Yeah. Now
right?
it's Breaking Bad.
Or for people of my age, The Big Lebowski. Whatever
Right.
it is, it's
Yeah.
people who thumb their nose at authority. So these assaults on authority and legitimacy, and at its core, what is truth, they have their consequences. Look, overall, I think it's very good that we don't, in lockstep fashion, just accept
Right.
whatever we're given. It is, you remember that bumper sticker from the 60s, question authority.
Right.
The other one on the car was kill your TV, by the way. No offense to your program, Coy.
None taken.
But these have become foundational in many ways. They have their consequences. So I think it is good for us
Right.
to question our authority. But when we start undermining basic facts, then I think we do. When we talk about a world of alternative facts, then I think we're in a world of hurt.
And it's deeply Orwellian. And I know everybody's throwing around 1984 and throwing around Orwell, but I mean, there's also a lot of Huxley in there as well with Brave New World. And where, for those who haven't read Brave New World, you need to go out and reread it right now. There's just a complete denial of the reality that's right in front of you. And in many ways, that is so deeply American if we think about the American South and the culture in the American South, to deny the real horrors of human slavery that were right in front of people all the time. And it reached the point, as you know, in the 1850s with the positive good theory that, oh no, this actually isn't a bad thing. All these horrors are actually good. And these people of color want to be enslaved.
Right.
They want to live close to white people and have these opportunities to do this wonderful work. And it was just absolutely twisted. It took reality, tragic horror, and turned it on its head. And so that idea of alternative fact, that's not new. That's not new in the American story, and it's certainly not new in the human story.
But in the 20th century, where we live in a world, again, to go back to your profession, it's the 20th century where newspapers like the New York Times began to embrace the notion that they were objective.
Right.
And in the 20th century, and creeping into the beginning of the 21st century, we really believed that we were getting better at distinguishing truth from fiction. And there was a broad consensus around a number of facts, certainly a number of truths. That consensus is what's been under assault for the last 40 and 50 years. And again, as much from the left as from the right.
And it fits with your observation a few moments ago that one of the things that characterizes this moment in time so much, so well, is that assault on the establishment, the assault on power that's coming from across the political spectrum. All kinds of Americans are assaulting the idea of legitimacy, power, establishment.
And one of the great dangers, again, there's so many good things about that in questioning, challenging, but one of the great dangers is that I believe that many people have a certain fundamental need for certainty. And the danger is finding that certainty in a strong personality, in somebody who pronounces boldly that they know the truth, and the truth is them. And we actually have never gone very far down that path with presidents in American history. We've gone down that path, we've had demagogues, right? I mean, I could rattle them off, and they've been on, again, on the left and the right. On the right, they've been George Wallace. On the left, they've been Huey Long. But those people were not ever nominated by a major party.
And they certainly never sat in the White House.
And they certainly never sat in the White House, as much as you or I could disagree with thousands of individual decisions by Democrats, Republicans, Whigs, you name it. We haven't had a president who has risen to power based on this kind of, some, to put it politely, would say populist appeal. Others
it's certainly not conservatism.
Others would say demagogic appeal.
And was it the very idea in the 18th century, the whole idea of the system that these white men set up in the 18th century was they were absolutely obsessed with the idea that a demagogue would take power in America. And they wanted to create a way that that wouldn't happen.
They would have called it a tyrant. I don't know that they would have said demagogue. They didn't have TV programs like yours, Coy. They didn't have the kind of mass media, but they did worry about tyrants.
But they knew what it was like, Brian, for a tyrant to take control and say, truth is what I say it is.
That is why they dispersed power when they wrote the Constitution.
Separation of powers, checks and balances.
That was the whole concept. Some of it was philosophical, descended from Montesquieu. I don't know if we're allowed to say that.
Yes, you are. You get as deep as you want.
All right, program. I'm not allowed to say that.
We got a very smart audience.
I'm not allowed to say that on public radio. But descended from philosophers. But some of it was very real-time concerns about what they just had been through in the revolution with King George.
And they didn't ever want to see that again.
That's what they were. That's what they built everything to protect against. There have been many moments in American history where we've been so frustrated with how decentralized and divided power is in the United States for that very reason. It hasn't always been easy. During the 1950s, many Americans were envious about the Soviet Union's ability to get things done because they spoke with one voice. They had a dictator. In fact, there's always been a little bit of dictator envy among Americans because, you know, Mussolini made the trains run on time. Yet, this kind of decentralized, spread, division of power, checks and balances, three branches of government.
It's there for a reason.
Federalism, in my opinion, has served us reasonably well over time.
So what does it say then, Brian, that Trump got past all of those firewalls? What does it say that, like him or not, his style is absolutely playbook classic demagogue, populist demagogue? And what does it say about the American people? What does it say about our system that he actually got to the White House? The very kind of man that the founders were most afraid of.
It says that the very kinds of challenges to traditional forms of authority that we started out talking about have eroded the power of institutions, political parties, for instance. It says that presidential candidates especially have the ability to connect almost intravenously these days with constituencies, unfiltered, direct. That's what Twitter is all about. And you know, people made fun of Trump for his rallies initially, and he's still talking about his numbers at rallies, and he's going to have one
Right,
on Saturday.
Right.
Right? But those rallies, I think, are very important because they are visible representation. They show visually Trump's connection to the people. We know that he connects with tens of millions through Twitter very directly. But when people see him and see his supporters, that makes them feel like they are the majority. We also know they're just a plurality.
Right.
But it confirms their sense that they are a majority that has been muted. And the one thing that really has changed is social media. It started really with the proliferation of television outlets. It started with the proliferation of radio outlets that could be a little bit different than Huntley Brinkley or network news in the 1960s. You started having cable channels, more outlet. But it just totally took off with social media, where you can connect. Again, I use the term intravenously, no filter, unfiltered. And listen to how many times people say Trump is unfiltered. We've probably had lots of politicians who have been unfiltered in the past, but they've never had the ability to be unfiltered and show up directly on your phone.
Does it compare, Brian, to that moment in the 30s with Roosevelt on the radio, the first time those fireside chats where the president would come into your living room for the first time and say, hey, it didn't sound like he was making a speech. It sounded like somebody was sitting in your living room on your couch and said, hey, I want to talk to you about America.
And the key to that, Coy, you really put your finger on something here. The key to that was that sense of intimacy. I do radio, I do podcasts. It's a surprisingly intimate form of media. And Roosevelt mastered that. You know, Twitter was around before Donald Trump. Radio was around before Franklin Roosevelt. The two of them are ingenious for mastering a new technology and applying it to mass politics.
And you certainly have to give him credit for that.
I absolutely give him credit for that.
Even though there's so many of his tweets that are just lies, and we know that, but it's almost like his supporters, they don't care. It's almost like I don't care if this is true, I just care that he is assaulting the left because he's standing up, this is what they feel, he's standing up for me.
I understand that, Coy, but I think there's something more foundational here, which is Donald Trump overcame so many hurdles. He was a laughingstock when he declared for his presidency. Nobody thought he would get on the big stage among 15 Republicans.
Right.
He did.
Let alone get the nomination.
Nobody thought he would get the nomination. He did. Nobody thought that he could possibly win. There had to be lots of Democrats who were, opening bottles of champagne when he got the nomination. He is the president of the United States, so his supporters can be forgiven for hanging in there with him when people, especially in what they would call the mainstream media, say, this has been a horrible 3 weeks. And he says, everything's going great. They can be forgiven for believing him because actually he turned out to be right when he made those bombastic claims about how far he was going to go.
Yeah. The media have, from the moment he stepped forward and said, I want to be taken seriously on the political stage, the media have been saying, we're not going to take you seriously and you're going to do horribly. And they continue to do that. And his supporters continue to say, you're wrong.
That's right.
Keep watching him.
You've been wrong all along. You're going to be wrong on this. And don't blame just the media. Scholars have been wrong. Many people who have studied this for decades turned out to be wrong about Donald Trump.
What do we make of it? And we've only got a couple minutes left, but I do want to get to this. What do we make of his insistence that part of his narrative, his messaging to people, and he's really speaking to his base here because he knows it resonates, is about fear? Is about fear of people of color, Brian? Whether from the inner city, south of the border, the Middle East, walking out of a mosque anywhere in the world, you need to be afraid of these people. These people are a threat to your lives and your livelihood.
Well, I do think that throughout much of American history, being able to make Americans fearful, whether legitimate or not, has been one of the ways that Americans have coalesced. Coalescing around a common enemy, whether it's the threat of communism in the 1950s or the French back in the 1790s, has been, for better or for worse, one of the ways that gets large numbers of people all of a sudden to put aside minor differences and come together around that one fear. So,
and anthropologists will tell us we're programmed to respond to that kind of thing.
So I happen to think that in President Trump's case, he has used this artificially to gin up artificial fears. Just as I think that Fox News, it's hard to watch it without taking going and reaching for the tranquilizer. There are red things flashing and everything. It's like the world is warning.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Exactly. I think that resonates right now because the basic American story is one of progress, and especially economic progress. And it's not so clear that the United States, as it becomes one of many economic powers in the world, rather than the economic power.
Great point.
When it becomes one of several military powers, now that a terrorist with a bomb in some ways can be just as disruptive as the United States with the Manhattan Project and its atomic weapons. As these power differentials are equalized, neutralized, that's not the way, at least my generation of Americans and a younger generation, that's not supposed to be the story. We're supposed to get better and stronger, not more equal with other nations.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating point in the human story where we are seeing a new narrative of the human experience. One falls away and a new one is coming into being.
Yeah,
it's being written as we sit here.
And I think the challenge of real leadership will be the leader who can level with the American people and say, our values are crucial to us. We're never going to give up our love of democracy and free debate.
Yeah.
But that's not always going to leave us as we're number one.
Brian, thank you for being here.
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed this.
Thank you for inviting me.
Brian Balogh is at the University of Virginia, and he's co-host of Backstory Radio, the nationally syndicated podcast. You can download shows at backstoryradio.org. You can find the complete archive of this program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.